Good morning, everyone. Bonjour, hello, Annie, and a huge thank you to Alex Campagnolo for that beautiful intro to start us off this morning. I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to the fourth and final day of the EECOM 2021 conference. My name is Hilary Inwood, and I'm lead of Environmental and Sustainability Ed on the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education at the University of Toronto. On behalf of my conference co-chairs, Lindsay Bunce of EcoSchools Canada and Hayley Higdon of Natural Curiosity, and our partners at the Toronto District School Board's EcoSchools program, we are thrilled that you're joining us this morning. As part of this conference, we have welcomed over 800 educators and youth from across Turtle Island, which is North America, and around the world. This has been a wonderful few days so far, and we're very grateful to all of the keynote speakers, presenters, and volunteers who have contributed their time, their expertise, and energy to make this a successful conference. We appreciate that land acknowledgements are contentious, yet we still believe in the importance of recognizing those who have come before us on this land. This conference is being hosted on the traditional territories, meeting grounds, and traveling routes of many Indigenous peoples, and continues to be the home of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people today. For thousands of years, the Mississauga, the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee have sought to walk gently on this land. This territory is currently covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga, also known as the Mississaugas of the Credit. It's also been referenced in other agreements, including the 24 Nations Wampum Belt and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. This acknowledgement signals our desire to seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one based on honor and deep respect. As part of it, we encourage you to consider the traditional territory that you are on today and let it act as a reminder that we are all subject to treaties, covenants, and agreements, depending on where you are. We encourage you as part of this conference to reflect on your commitment to furthering the work of decolonization and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups, and to use this acknowledgement as a starting point to enact this critical work in your personal and professional lives. 2 days ago, my home institution, commonly known as OISE, was the first faculty of ed in the country to declare a state of climate emergency. Now, while many people at this conference would argue that the climate emergency declaration is really not fresh news, this is a very symbolic move on OISE's part, and one that we hope raises awareness and encourages other faculties of education across Canada to do the same. So I'd like to share some of the words in OISE's statement, or declaration, as they help foreground our selection of the 4 themes of this Urban Environmental Education Conference, which include Indigenous education, eco-justice education, water education, and city and classroom, and will also help to foreground this morning's keynote talk. OISE's declaration and this conference recognize that there's an urgent need for all levels of education to help Canadian communities address, mitigate, and adapt to the wicked challenges of the climate crisis, the impacts of which are being felt locally and around the world. We recognize that the climate crisis and climate injustices that are being experienced more intensely by those who are least responsible for its causes, including those who are Indigenous, Black, racialized, living in poverty and in the global South and other marginalized peoples. Environmental and sustainability education and climate action can work hand in hand, but cannot be separated from broader justice movements. Colonialism, racism, capitalism, and other forms of oppressive power structures have created and continue to maintain these inequities. In order to move towards a just recovery from the pandemic and a more sustainable future, we must prioritize seeking justice for all people and living beings around the world, as well as for the lands and waters. As delegates at this EECOM conference, we ask you to collectively contribute to enacting sustainability, climate justice, and climate action in your work in education, but doing so from a hopeful stance. Use the resources and expertise of your organization to address the systemic issues underlying the climate crisis. And please take what you have learned home over the last few days and what you were about to learn from this morning's esteemed keynote speaker, Dr. Julian Agyeman, to do all that you can to advance environmental and sustainability education within your local, national, and global communities. And with that, I'd like to welcome Richard Lennon, who's Regional Manager, Metro Ontario and Atlantic Regions, who on behalf of TD Friends of the Environment Foundation will introduce our keynote speaker. Richard.
Thank you so much. Hi, good morning and welcome everybody. As you just mentioned, my name is Richard Lennon and I'm a regional manager with TD Friends of the Environment Foundation here at TD Bank. I'm super happy to be here this morning to welcome you all to what's sure to be another great day at EECOM 2021. Before I welcome today's keynote speaker, I'd like to take a moment to tell everyone about the work TD Friends of the Environment Foundation supports. Established in 1990, FEF is one of Canada's longest serving environmental charities. In our 31st year, we have a long history of supporting grassroots environmental projects from charitable organizations and schools all across the country. In fact, last year, we crossed the $100 million mark in terms of donations, having given to over 28,000 projects. I'm very proud and excited to represent TD FEF and to witness firsthand all the truly incredible projects and school initiatives that are happening all across Canada. Together, they're making a real difference in increasing and improving environmental education and environmental stewardship. With that, I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Julian Agyeman, a PhD, is a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University. He's the originator of the increasingly influential concept of just sustainabilities, the intentional integration of social justice and environmental sustainability. He centers his research on critical explorations of the complex and embedded relations between humans and the urban environment, whether mediated by governments or social movement organizations, and their effects on public policy and planning processes and outcomes, particularly in relation to notions of justice and equity. Julian is the author or editor of 11 books, including the 2003 book, Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World, the 2011 book, Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability, and the 2015 work, Sharing Cities, A Case for Truly Smart and Sustainable Cities, which was one of Nature's top 20 books of 2015. In 2018, he was awarded the Athena City accolade by KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden, for his outstanding contribution to the field of social justice and ecological sustainability, environmental policy, and planning. It's my pleasure to welcome to the virtual stage, Dr. Julian Agyeman.
Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you to EECOM for organizing this and for inviting me to offer my thoughts and comments. I'll just get my screen ready to share and then we can go. Okay. So, what I want to talk about this morning is just sustainabilities in urban policy, planning and practice. And, you know, I come from a background, my PhD was kind of urban studies, environmental education. What I want you to take from this is a critical lens on some contemporary urban issues. But before I do that, I'd like to offer a land recognition. I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm presenting on the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, their past, their present, and their future, and commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. This book in 2002 really was the watershed. It was the book that really described what we meant by just sustainabilities. I'd like to just take a few minutes to think about some of the ideas that were present in our minds at the time. What we were concerned with was what we thought of as the equity deficit in much sustainability thinking. Post-Rio in 1992, really all of the best practice databases were full of great environmental projects, and environment is a very important part of sustainability, obviously, but I could envision you know, a world where we regulated it for being environmentally sustainable, but it could still be deeply socially unjust. And so this book embarked on a bold project. It wasn't just one chapter, as usually is in these sustainability books, and usually I get asked to write the equity chapter. This book was all about how issues of equity and social justice permeate and pervade and intersect with environmental sustainability issues. And so the book focused explicitly, every chapter, on equity and justice, in effect, on the links between environmental quality and human equality. And, you know, let me say from the outset, think about environmental degradation the world over. It is almost always associated with human rights abuses and social injustices. You know, I challenge you to come up with an environmental degradation that isn't related in some ways to people who have less power, to abusing human rights around the world or social injustice. So we were arguing in this book that sustainability can't simply be a green or environmental concern, important though those aspects of sustainability are. What we were asking for, what we were calling for, was a sustainable society as one where wider questions of social need, social welfare, and economic opportunity were integrally related to supporting, to environmental limits imposed by supporting ecosystems. I'm an academic. I don't usually sell other people's books, but I want you all to take a look at this book. This book is a fundamentally important book, 2009, The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone. And what they did was they picked data from around the world, 40 years of quantitative comparable data from around the world. And here's the headline. It's not poverty, it is inequality that is the most corrosive force in our society. Inequality, the gap between rich and poor. And they found, and they detail in exquisite detail, they found that countries with the bigger gap between rich and poor had many more social malaises, whether it was teen pregnancy, drug abuse, incarceration, school dropouts, you name it, it increased with increasing inequality. What they also did was, and I think very interesting, they correlated advertising revenues with increasing inequality. Advertisers love inequality. Inequality sells. So the countries with the biggest gap between rich and poor also have the biggest advertising revenues. Inequality heightens competitive consumption. Inequality makes us participate in keeping up with the Joneses. So whether it was from the poor to the middle class, to the middle class, to the upper middle class, etc., we are on an escalator of consumption, which increases the more unequal our societies are. Now, from an environmental point of view, this is very interesting because what does competitive consumption drive? It drives our carbon footprint. So they argue that actually inequality is one big driver of climate change. Whenever I look around, I don't hear people talking about that. I hear about sustainable transportation, we need sustainable agriculture. Yes, we do. But what we do need to do is to recognize that inequality, social justice is a driver, or social injustice is a driver of climate change. So if we really want to understand sustainability or just sustainabilities, we should focus on both human equality and environmental quality together. How do I define just sustainabilities? Well, it's the need to ensure a better quality of life for all, now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. And in this, there are 4 conditions. We must commit to improving people's quality of life and well-being. We must commit to meeting the needs of both present and future generations. We must commit to deepening justice and equity in terms of recognition, process, procedure, and outcome. Now, traditionally, the kind of environmental justice position has been about procedural equity, people getting a right to have voice in decision-making about policies and plans and laws, and distribution. Environmental injustice was seen to be the maldistribution, the unequal distribution of the goods and bads. I want to focus in on the term recognition there. This is increasingly important, and certainly in my work, because the greatest cry at the moment for recognition is Black Lives Matter. Say her name, say his name. Indigenous rights, Black rights, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, able disablist issues. If we do not recognize the right of these people to be part of the human community, how can we ever reconcile with them? And further down the line, how can we ever participate in some form of restorative justice and perhaps reparations? Recognition is fundamentally important as a precursor almost to justice. We must undertake these 3 conditions within the limits of ecosystems, the so-called one planet living principle. I just want to, shout out the fact that my just sustainabilities concept came well before, of course, the present 2015-2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm extremely pleased that they fully interrogate the concepts of justice and equity. And I also would like to say that my friend Kate Raworth and her Donut Economics is, in effect, just sustainability. That safe and just space for humanity that you see there, the donut, is actually the space of just sustainabilities, below the ecological ceiling, but living above the social foundation. That's precisely what just sustainabilities is. Now, working in urban planning as I do now, I want to give you three thoughts that I want you to keep in your mind as I go through my three examples of just sustainability. So, number one, what is urban planning? It is managing our coexistence in shared space. What a simple, beautiful explanation. That's what we do. We want to coexist in shared space. And whether we're talking about environmental, transport, housing, or other conflicts, these happen in our cities. And how do we do these issues? How do we improve environmental, transport, housing issues in cities of difference? We're in cities where we are increasingly in the presence of the other. These are cities of difference. And as Leonie Sandercock implores us, Leonie Sandercock, of course, from UBC, implores us, how do we coexist in these shared spaces with people who are increasingly different from us? How do we make strangers neighbors? Second, I want to challenge you to think about the relationship between belonging and becoming. Increasingly important in my work is the recognition that sustainability advocates, urban planners, we're all about what the city can become. It can become more sustainable, sharing city, more resilient, more healthy. It can become all of those. But what we're not so good at in the urban planning world is who gets to belong. We are denying belonging to increasing numbers of people, be they immigrants, be they underhoused or homeless people, be they people of color, BIPOC, as we say in the United States. How do we balance belonging and becoming? Because if we don't do that much better than we're doing at the moment, what our cities are going to become is elite spaces with elite dreams of what cities can become. I would say that our cities can only become as good as who gets to belong in those cities. And I'm going to give you lots of examples of how we are denying belonging. And then finally, I want you to think about this idea from the Congress for New Urbanism here in the United States of human scale planning. Great, I like it. But I want you to put an E on the word human. I want humane scaled planning. I want planning for human dignity. I want planning with empathy. I want planning that deepens our commitment to each other. And I'm going to talk about that in my examples. And the three examples I want to give are this concept of spatial justice that I'm really quite interested in. How do we allocate rights in urban spaces and places? Second, I want to talk about what I call the Minneapolis paradox. How does one of the most green, wealthy, liberal cities in the United States end up as the epicenter of our current introspection over structural racism? And finally, I want to challenge you through the concept of food justice to think about what is local food in intercultural societies. Who gets to say what local is and what is local food? So let me start with spatial justice. We all know social justice. Opportunity shouldn't be available based on your race, your class, or gender, or other factors. Spatial justice says opportunity shouldn't be distributed spatially. But in US cities especially, and I'm sure Canadian cities as well, it is exactly that. We have spatially unjust cities, and that's not by accident. That's by design, as I'm going to show you. Now, we don't have cities generally around the world with walls so much these days. I mean, Jerusalem, Nicosia in Cyprus, formerly Belfast. But what we do have in US cities certainly is we have a freeway, a railway line, a creek, a river. And on one side they live, and on the other side you live. And their life chances, their life expectancy is less than yours. How do we understand spatial injustices, and how do we start to dismantle the factors that led to our spatially unjust cities? And I'll give you one example. The city of St. Louis in Missouri is, there's a road called the Delmar Boulevard. And it's actually called the Delmar Divide. Between north of the road and south of the road, two different communities, African American and white. Harvard Medical School did a study and found that your zip code is more important than your genetic code in determining your lifespan. People north, I forget which way it is, whether it's north or south, but the African American life expectancy north or south of the boulevard is much less than the white middle class community, either north or south, depending on which way around it is. Why should your zip code be more important than your genetic code in determining your lifespan? Spatial injustice. It is baked into the DNA of our cities. Let me bring this down to the street level. Look at these two streets. One is Massachusetts Avenue, near where I live in Cambridge. The other one is Södervägen in Gothenburg, Sweden. They could not be more spatially differentiated. They're identical width. The Swedish have imposed spatial justice on the street. They have imposed a democratization of the street, whereas our access to street space in the US is predicated on A, having a vehicle, and B, the size of that vehicle. The bigger the vehicle, the more space you can command. That's the way it is. And I often think about, imagine you're a kid growing up on those two streets. How are you wired differently? What does your morning walk to school look like? What are you thinking about when in Sweden you see order, you see a prioritization of active transportation, of people walking, cycling, people in streetcars, and to the left of the streetcars you can see there's a fence. That's the only part of the street that private vehicles are allowed in. The Swedish kid, I'm sure, is wired differently to the American kid. And we have data on this. We know that on heavily trafficked streets, people have much less friendships and much less interactions than they do on lightly trafficked streets. Street traffic affects social interaction. What's the Just Sustainabilities take here? Who lives in the neighborhoods with heavy traffic and who lives in the neighborhoods with light traffic? Who lives in the neighborhoods with street trees, with bump outs, with benches, with cycle lanes, the highly walkable neighborhoods, the complete streets neighborhoods, and who lives in the heavily trafficked neighborhoods? So I think there you can see spatial injustice is, again, baked into the DNA of our cities, and it shows in terms of social interaction and vehicle preponderance and velocity. We do have some good news in the US. Mayor Bloomberg hired Janet Sadiq Khan, who was a great transportation commissioner. She brought in Jan Gehl, the architect of the Copenhagen Miracle. They worked with the wonderful civic organizations on transportation justice. And in the bottom right, you can see New York today. This is Broadway outside Macy's. This is a people street. Yes, we can do this. We need political will and vision to be able to do it. But one thing I want you to think about when you think about these pictures, planning, urban planning has to be about what is possible, not what is probable. If we keep doing what we've probably always done, we will stick in the same tired paradigm and deepen or at least just maintain the spatial and social injustices in our communities. We can change, we just have to think about what is possible, not what is probable. I did mention, though, earlier on about this idea of belonging. We're really good at designing in non-belonging. And here's very good examples. We're good at hostile urban design, hostile architecture. Top left, we deny kids the skateboarding rights of ledges by putting studs in. We put armrests on outdoor benches to stop homeless people. Even more egregious, we design in studs to stop people sleeping in ledges where they might get a little bit extra warmth from the cold outdoors. It's like what we do to stop pigeons on ledges. We put spikes. This is inhumane. It's non-empathetic. It's undignified to do this to another human being. That's why I want humane scale planning. Equally egregious is the rich door, poor door issue. Many cities have ordinances that say above a certain size, there's got to be a certain amount of affordable units. Well, some architects and planners put the rich doors at the front, and then the people in the affordable accommodations have to go in through the back alley so that the poor people don't interact with the rich people who just jump into the high-speed elevators and go up to the penthouses up at the top. On the left, we have a bridge in Seattle. Used to be a homeless encampment there, so the city of Seattle thought, what can we do? How can we get public support to get rid of these people? So they put bike racks there. Cynical, using sustainability infrastructure to move homeless people on. Not acceptable, and thankfully the Seattle cycling community said it's not acceptable. We have a homeless problem, Seattle. We need resources and policy, not cycling infrastructure. Now, one very interesting concept that I've been thinking about a lot is the idea of the cosmopolitan canopy. And my friend Elijah Anderson at Yale, sociologist, has written extensively about this. And his point is, we walk around the streets studiously avoiding people's eyes, but there are certain places in cities, and he calls them cosmopolitan canopies, where we are civil, where we are dignified, where we sit with the other and we eat, we watch a ball game, we talk across difference. Cosmopolitan canopies are places where contact theory works. Contact theory says the more opportunities you have to meet people who are different to you, the more likely you are to be tolerant and supportive of more policies pro integration of different communities, while accepting difference, of course. Now, are cosmopolitan canopies going to get rid of racism? No, they're not at all. But we do need spaces of engagement in our cities where we come together across difference. And food spaces, like Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia here, food spaces are very good for that, as are kids spaces. And I asked the question, is there a role for planning and planners and urban designers in creating, or at least creating the conditions through which cosmopolitan canopies can occur? Think about your own town or city. Where are the cosmopolitan canopies? How can we increase those? Can we extend the cosmopolitan canopy across the city? Another solution in many ways, so urban planners think, to spatial justice or spatial injustice is the concept of complete streets. And on the right, I managed to find Toronto's Complete Streets design manual. The others are from Massachusetts. Can this idea of complete streets, which is virtually a social movement as well as a discourse, a set of design ideas, can it decenter the automobile and recenter human and active transportation? Or will it just result in neighborhoods of enhanced livability for the most privileged? Now, one thing, again, in my work as a critical urban planner is to think, what is a complete street and who gets to say what a complete street is? Well, it's mainly urban designers who get to say what a complete street is, and they're very much physically trained designers. They don't know Doreen Massey's point that streets are social ecologies of constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. They don't know that. They don't seem to understand that the street on the bottom left is the product of human enterprise and interaction. We can design our streets in ways that they do, but we have to understand the anthropology and the sociology of the street. And one of my worries is that the physically focused complete streets rhetoric is disconnecting our streets, the physical street, from significant social, symbolic, discursive, and historical realities. And to really nail this, Los Angeles, would you believe, has a complete streets policy and is doing a lot of good work. But Los Angeles is the biggest metropolis in North America for Latinx and Southeast Asian people. One of their great cultural proclivities is street vending. It was banned in Los Angeles until very recently. How do you declare we have a complete streets policy when you criminalize two communities, two huge ethnicities' approach to street life, street sociology? Now, luckily, LA has rescinded that decision, but not for the complete streets argument. They did it to protect the vendors during the Trump administration because they felt that the vendors would be easy prey for ICE enforcement. But you get my point here. How can these streets said to be complete if they don't include the livelihoods and economic survival of these vendors from Latinx and Southeast Asian communities? Now, pushing a little further, the complete streets idea is contributing to gentrification and greenlining. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about redlining in a few minutes, but redlining was an explicitly racist policy where certain neighborhoods were deemed hazardous and were not allowed to have government or private sector funding. And of course, those neighborhoods were largely African American or people of color. So where was I? So yeah, greenlining, gentrification, these are great problems that we're having certainly in cities in the US, and I suspect you are in Canada as well. Now, this is a book series that I'm co-editor of, Routledge, Equity, Justice and the Sustainable City series. And the book on the right, Green Gentrification, actually says greening richens and whitens neighborhoods. And this is this concept of greenlining. Imagine you have all of these complete streets projects and they coalesce into a whole neighborhood of complete streets. What you're then getting is a green-lined neighborhood. Redlining was racist. Greenlining is about sustainability, but in the US, certainly it pays, or sorry, you have to pay to get into these green neighborhoods, and there's a heavy premium, as I'm going to go and show you. So one of our worries is that in developing these sustainable neighborhoods, which everybody should have access to, we are systematically reproducing the urban spatial and social inequalities and injustices that have characterized US and I suspect North American cities for the last century or more. One of the key metrics, I think, of urban sustainability is walkability. How walkable is your neighborhood? And there is a measure for that called Walk Score. And Walk Score is an app that basically lets you know how walkable your neighborhood is from 0 to 100. A realtor will use this. Many of you know this. I mean, you've seen realty ads for apartments or houses, and it talks about a walkable neighborhood. Who owns the app called Walk Score? Well, it's Redfin, a North American, I think it's US-based online realty company. But let's just take stock of this. A realty company owns the app that measures how walkable our urban neighborhoods are. And it's no coincidence that this screenshot doesn't show any neighborhood, it shows the High Line in New York. The High Line is one of the most gentrified neighborhoods in the United States. And, you know, it's a highly walkable neighborhood, but we have commodified and compromised sustainability in that now realtors are using sustainability to sell products. Think about the other spaces that we use in cities. Now, the street is our most commonly used space. This is why I talked about it first, but I want to talk a little bit about parks. Parks are very interesting to me. My friend Seth Lowe at CUNY has said that, you know, in this new century, we're facing a different kind of threat to public space, not one of disuse, but of patterns of design and management, and I would also say programming, that excludes some people and reduce social and cultural diversity. How about co-design, co-management and co-programming of parks with communities? Wouldn't that result in better spaces, better meaning, more inclusive, more useful, more durable, more easily socially policed, if you like, if communities were involved? I really am interested in this idea of co-production, co-design, co-management, and co-programming of public spaces. A very interesting report came out in 2004 in Boston, Immigrant Engagement in Public Open Space Strategies for the New Boston. What was interesting with this report is that it really started to get people thinking about how do immigrants use public spaces in old established cities like Boston. In November, you don't know this, but there is a mayoral election in Boston. There are 6 candidates, 2 men, 4 women. They are all of color. We are going to have an elected mayor of color in Boston. This is huge. Boston's one of the final major cities not to have had a mayor of color. But the point here is perhaps the city's politics are going to change, but we still have these pockets of Friends of the Park organizations, and you have them in Canada as well. And we know who's on the boards of these Friends of. They don't look like the city. What's the political nexus between these pockets of white privilege on the one hand and these new go-ahead progressive Democrats councils? How do they work together? How does Olmsted's vision continue to resonate with those, with many Bostonians of all creeds? But our politics are changing. How is that going to change the Olmstedian visions? These are some of the tensions I think we need to think about. And one thing that I'm very interested in is how do immigrants recreate? What do they do? how do they go to spaces? How do they find spaces of engagement, places where they can belong? And one very interesting quote here is from a Guatemalan American. I think one of the reasons that that place is so popular with us Latinos is because of the willows. Willows in Guatemala are very common. They grow beside rivers. People like Herta Park on the banks of the River Charles because it looks like home. Familiarity, people seeking out landscapes that are familiar to them, or what I call landscape links. In Copenhagen, they've taken a slightly different approach to engagement and belonging. Superkilen Park in the very heavily immigrant Nørrebro district of Copenhagen is a linear park with a cycle lane going down the middle. This is Copenhagen, of course there is. And the park is in 3 sections, and you can see it's full of artifacts from different cultures represented. Belonging by familiarity, so designing in engagement. So whereas the Guatemalan and the willows, that was a natural course, a natural selection because the Guatemalans like the willows, here the Danes are trying to design in engagement and encounter through using artifacts from different cultures. And I think what this all speaks to is the need for deep ethnographies. I'm sick and tired of just urban planners using demographic data. What does demographic data tell us? It tells us the percentage of a certain group of people that are in society. It tells us nothing about their daily social practices, their cultures, their beliefs, their dreams. Deep ethnographies, and there's a great group, for those of you who are interested, in the Department of Landscape at Sheffield University in the UK, called the Transnational Urban Outdoors Research Group. They've produced this brilliant Refugees Welcome in Parks resource book. Who needs public space, parks, more than these people have been traumatized, asylum seekers, refugees? How can we use this ethnographic understanding to inform our design practice? And this paper, I do urge you to get a copy of this paper. It's in the journal Local Environment that I edit. It's brilliant. It asks us all kinds of questions that we should be asking in the shift from using demographic data to deep ethnographic data. And going back to what I was talking about co-production, why not let's co-produce deep ethnographies? Imagine if the City of Toronto, neighborhood by neighborhood, produced deep ethnographies, co-produce them between planners and local people. Wouldn't that be a great way of moving the dial in terms of involvement and getting people involved in the local environment? The second issue that I wanted to talk about, as I said, was the Minneapolis paradox. And I wrote a piece in The Conversation called Urban Planning as a Tool of White Supremacy, the Other Lesson from Minneapolis. We cannot separate how we police our communities from how we've planned our communities. That needs to be our next thing to think about. There's an introspection on policing in the United States at the moment. We need introspection on urban planning. So let's think about Minneapolis. It's a green city. It's got the best park system in the United States, 10 years running, according to the Trust for Public Lands, one of the best cities in the US for exercise. It's got the 3rd most bike commuters in the US. It's affordable, it's got opportunity, it's got wealth. That's if you're white. If you're not white, it's not so good. The racial inequality in Minneapolis is among the worst in the nation. The black-white income gap is near the top. The black-white home ownership gap, the so-called wealth gap, is at the top in the nation. And the opportunity gap, sometimes called the achievement gap at K through 12 education, is very, very high between white and Native American and white and black. So we have an unjust sustainability. It's a green city, environmentally sustainable, green, but it's deeply socially unjust. So going back to what I was saying, this is a classic case of a need for an approach of just sustainabilities. So why? Why is Minneapolis like that? There's a fascinating project called Mapping Prejudice, where Kirsten Delegard, a historian, has talked about all that civic rhetoric about Minneapolis being a model metropolis at the cutting edge of great urban planning obscures darker truths about the city. And so I embarked on a journey to find out, what are these darker truths about Minneapolis? Well, prior to 1900, Minneapolis had a small but well-distributed African-American population. And then around the turn of the 19th or 20th century, we got the introduction of racialized covenants. This property shall not be rented or leased to anybody other than members of the Caucasian race, Negroid, Mongoloid, Oriental, Turkish, horrifically racist language, horrifically. Go online and take a look. They've got some of the original covenants. Within about 20 or 30 years, we saw the development of the Black community, the BIPOC community of North Minneapolis, directly as a result of racialized covenants. Until 1917 in the US, racialized zoning was legal. And then it was struck down by the Supreme Court and replaced with single family zoning. We can't discriminate racially, but we can discriminate socioeconomically. And that in the US is a good proxy for race as well. So single family zoning, of which Minneapolis was 70%, was introduced. And then we had redlining. So any one of covenants, zoning, redlining is pretty powerful, but the synergistic effects meant deep racial segregation then and now. Only one country on the planet has done it better than us, and that is apartheid South Africa with the Group Areas Act and passes and things like that. What's Minneapolis thinking about this? Well, the Director of Long Range Planning acknowledges the direct linkages between those past practices and today's modern zoning plans, and the fact that it needs to be undone. My point is urban planning is the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. Now, to its credit, Minneapolis is doing a lot. It was the first city in the US, the first large city to abandon single family zoning in favor of allowing duplexes and triplexes, inclusionary zoning, and it's also got a quite ambitious Minneapolis 2040 plan. And again, I ask you to go and take a look at it. The number one goal is to eliminate disparities. This is really good. You need to be upfront and direct on this. In 2040, Minneapolis will see all communities fully thrive regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, religion, or zip code, having eliminated deep-rooted disparities in wealth, opportunity, housing, safety, and health. I do want to leave you, when thinking about Minneapolis, with one thought. 93% of Minneapolis police force don't live in Minneapolis. Literally, we bus in the police to police neighborhoods. Would things be different if the police looked a little bit more like the communities in which George Floyd was so tragically murdered, and we can say murdered now? Final thoughts I want to think about is food. And again, I'm offering you a sneak peek of a book here, Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class and Sustainability. But the question I wanted to go to straight away was, what are local foods in intercultural societies? This is a really interesting story. There's George and Julia Bowling on the bottom right, two tobacco farmers in Maryland. And the state of Maryland has been pushing farmers to get out of tobacco and into other stuff. So being good farming entrepreneurs, the Bowlings started to think, well, what are we going to grow? And they realized that there's 120,000 Africans in the DC area, and they want to eat locally grown African food. They don't want it flown in. These Africans are diplomats, lawyers, policymakers, they're doctors, they're surgeons. There's more Ghanaian doctors in the Maryland and DC area than there are in Ghana. But I say this because part of my ethnicity, part of my heritage is Ghanaian. It fascinates me. These huge, great medical centers in DC and Maryland have started to, really increase the brain drain from a lot of African countries. So the Bowlings got together with members of the African community, and they got together with the University of Maryland Extension Service, and they looked at what will grow. And there's now a resource pack showing what can be grown in the Maryland climate and soils, what some of the culture behind some of the crops is, some recipes and things like that. And so the signboard now to the Bowling farm is that signboard that you see there. You're driving down the Maryland countryside and you see a sign that says African produce. I mean, it must seem like, the British TV series Black Mirror, a really kind of bizarre thing, African produce in the middle of Maryland. But the question is, what are local foods? Are they what the largely ecologically minded alternative food movement wants to call local, or are they what our increasing numbers of immigrants want to think of as local? It's a really important question. And as a geographer, there is no such thing as local. It is a question of how we define it. And it seems that many immigrants are defining it in cultural ways, as are the Filipinos in San Diego. When asked by a young PhD researcher, what is local food to you? It's what we grow in our yards. It's what we eat in our restaurants. Clearly, immigrants are invoking the concept of translocalism. They're bringing their local with them. Do we see a link here? The Guatemalan seeking out the willows on the banks of the River Charles, the Africans wanting their food grown in Maryland, the Filipinos seeing their food as local food. In Greater Vancouver, many of you probably don't know this, but nearly 20% of farmers in Greater Vancouver are Chinese Canadians. And they don't use the farmers markets. They've got their own network of farmers markets. So here we have two of the key concepts in alternative food, local and farmers market, being challenged by immigrant groups. So the farmers markets of the Chinese are set up along roads, in communities, etc. I gave this talk in Vancouver about 10 years ago, and an East African woman who just moved to Vancouver came up to me and said, Julian, I always shop at the Chinese markets because they grow the food that I want to grow. Another example of this link, this umbilical link between where you're from and where you are now, came from South Central Farm in LA. It was, before it was bulldozed in 2006, the biggest urban farm in the United States. 96% of the farmers were Latinx. And here's a picture of two women from Oaxaca. You can see they're not only growing culturally relevant foods, but they're growing it in a way that they would grow it back at their home in Oaxaca. I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. We grow the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home, and this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States. So important, this umbilical link between where you're from and where you are now. We also have a network of farms in the United States, 50 of them currently. This is New Roots Farm. My own university, Tufts, has a farm in Lowell, Massachusetts called New Entry Farms, where new farmers, immigrants, refugees can get a first footing in US agriculture and mix with more established farmers and have a sort of intercultural skills share. Very, very important. But we don't see this, all of what I've just described, we don't see this. This isn't reported in your usual alternative food movement kind of reports. This has to be sought out. So I want to give voice to these people that are looking at and trying to eke out a living in different ways through the land in the United States. And my latest book is The Immigrant Food Nexus, Borders, Labor and Identity in North America, which, if you're interested in immigrants and food and the role of food in the daily social practices of immigrants and the role of immigration in food policy and the role of food policy in immigration, then this is the book for you. So let me summarize. We need to think much better, if we're to move towards a just sustainability, about managing coexistence in shared space. We need to foster belonging. We really, really need to foster belonging as much as we are fostering notions and dreams of what cities can become. We need to foster engagement and belonging using deep ethnographies. Ditch the demographics, get into deep ethnographies. We need to engage in intercultural, culturally competent planning and policy. We need to practice humane scaled as well as human scaled urban planning. And above all, social justice never simply happens. It never happens. Give me a policy that was designed for economic efficiency, environmental protection, that has increased somehow social justice, and I will give you a complete set of my books. It just doesn't happen. We need to center social justice and equity, and then we will get more socially just and equitable outcomes. Thank you.
Wow, Julian, what a fantastic way to start our last day of this conference. You have introduced us to such a rich set of ideas. I really love this intersection that you have introduced, and you really were one of the I hesitate to use the word pioneers, but one of the first people, one of the first scholars to really be starting to introduce this notion of just sustainabilities that has caught on like wildfire and has been so completely tied to notions of the pandemic in terms of a just recovery moving forward.
It's interesting, Hilary, because I'm getting a lot of emails from former students from, say, 20 years ago who said, I took your class on just sustainabilities back then, and it was very interesting, but I really understand now what you're talking about, given the move of issues from 20 years. Yeah, thank you.
And certainly some of the things that are going to stay with me from your talk, this notion of inequality being the most important indicator, the gap between rich and poor in terms of sustainability. There's also this notion that urban planning and policing are linked, kind of smacked me in the face today. And I think you're absolutely right about that. I loved these concepts that you introduced us to. Many of these were new to me. Notions of spatial justice and transportation justice was fascinating. Cosmopolitan canopies. Complete streets. I mean, I'm not an urban designer, I'm an educator, but I can see how this weaves completely into the work that we do in education, and how if we're introducing these concepts to our students, then it's more likely for them to have those seeds planted with them when they're young and help move these ideas forward. This notion of translocalism and autotopographies that relate to food justice, fascinating as well. So we've already got a couple of questions. I am going to invite members of our audience this morning to pop questions into the chat. We've got some time, which is lovely. Thank you, Julian, for leaving time for questions. So I'm going to start with one from Linda Ryan, who has asked the question of this. Do you think that the absence of racialized farmers from local farmers markets are by design? Is that they're not comfortable in the spaces? We see some of the same phenomenon that you have referenced in the GTA, and Linda's given the example of Punjabi farmers in the Brampton and Caledon area. They tend to sell directly from their farms or roadside stands rather than participating in local markets. So she's asking about the connection between or the absence of racialized farmers and from local farmers markets.
Well, so this is very interesting, and I would recommend getting the book Cultivating Food Justice, because we look at exactly that. There's a narrative of the alternative food movement, whether it's in Canada or in the United States or the UK, and it's a narrative that is privileged. If you look at some of the imagery, buy fresh, buy local, you don't see ethnic crops, you see kind of Euro crops. You don't see black hands, you see white faces. There's an exclusivity woven into the narrative of a lot of the alternative food movement. And that's why in my section on food justice, I foreground immigrants, people of color, and what they're doing as local food actors. So I think, yes. Now, when you speak to people in the alternative food movement, they're absolutely shocked that, oh my God, we're not racist, we're not exclusive. But what they don't see, because of their privileged positionality, is the exclusive notions that they're weaving in. Even notions of what is a healthy diet, are very racialized. Notions of taste have been absolutely shown to be linked to socioeconomic and racial issues. So yes, I mean, there are exclusivities woven into the narrative of the alternative food movement that that prevent certain groups getting involved. Yeah, absolutely.
And I've got a second related question from Jeff Stickney. Jeff asks, can you address the complex interrelationship between food and diet, identity, ethnicity, and the location where we as teachers address ecological advice about eating lower on the food chain and consuming less meat?
Wow. In 15 seconds, yes, I can do
it. Well, you've got more than 15 seconds.
Look, it absolutely is very complex. And how do we give dietary advice? Who gives dietary advice? What is good dietary advice? When I think about sustainability and sustainability education, what are some of the key thoughts that we have? Local is a big issue. And then less is another issue, isn't it? Less is more. We are always telling, we need to consume less, we need to consume less. That's okay for us who, can afford to pick and choose. We can vote with our forks. But what about the family that can't vote with their fork, or the family that is already living on less? How does the sustainability message, making do with less, work? It's almost offensive to people who don't have anything to start with. Similarly, this idea of local. Local is being used, believe me, in the US by nativist sentiments. When I look at the imagery, the imagination of the alternative food movement, it's small mom and pop farms. It's going back. It's a past America. It's not a present or future America. So I think disentangling and doing some work, thinking about the pejorative nature of some of the concepts that the questioner is asking, I think that's the main thing to do. Start looking at what you're saying, run it past some people. I'm happy to work with any of you that want to, improve the resources and thinking that you have around some of these issues. It's so easy to make mistakes and to give advice that excludes rather than includes, and it's very easy to do that. But I would be happy to to help groups think about how we change that and decolonize in many ways some of the advice that we give or some of the teaching that we do.
Well, and another related question from Haley Guest comes about working with youth in this way. She's asked, can you recommend any books or resources for engaging youth with urban planning and just sustainabilities?
Yeah, I mean, there are many cities, certainly in the US, I'm not sure in Canada, that are doing really good things with sort of schools being, working with urban planning departments, looking at some of the issues, doing some data analysis, doing some practical hands-on stuff. When I worked in London back in the 80s and 90s, I worked in an urban planning department, and we had a day each year called Plan Away Day, where we opened up the planning department to schools, and schools could come and look at GIS. Well, actually, this was just in the very early days of GIS, but they could come and look at some of the resources, speak to urban planners. What do they do? They could trail urban planners doing meetings and things like that. So I think there's plenty of ways. We've just got to be imaginative to get youth and young people involved. Have them think about public spaces, what those spaces mean. I think there's many different ways. I would also, look at York University. I think they're doing some great work at the Faculty of the Environment at York University. My friend Jay Pitter is doing some great work, obviously, in Toronto, and there's many people doing significant work with other voices, different voices in urban planning.
And Georgia Marucci's question relates to that as well. So the question is that many of our new schools in Ontario are built in the middle of subdivisions rather than being closer to protected natural areas. So if you could give advice to planners, what would you say in terms of, connecting those dots a little bit better?
I'm not sure I understand exactly the question.
Well, I think the question is, how can we really better connect schools and urban planning of schools to green spaces?
Well, so here's an interesting thing. After I finished high school geography teaching, I went to work in the late 80s in an urban studies centre in London, because I was there teaching geography up in the Lake District in England, beautiful, but we were always bussing kids out from these council estates, housing projects, busing them out to these beautiful natural environments. What are we saying to kids when we bus them out to pristine beauty? We're saying this is nature, this is the environment, when actually the environment was where they lived. And this is why I moved from geography teaching into urban studies, to an urban studies centre where we had kids coming and looking at real urban issues, about bus routes and housing availability and urban pollution and why different neighbourhoods look different. So I really wanted to see kids gain expertise and understanding and some form of agency over their own environment rather than bussing them out. But yes, access to green space is intimately correlated to issues of race and obviously socioeconomic issues. And I didn't mention this, but those much vaunted urban parks in Minneapolis have what's called a racial cordon around them. Those parks were rimmed by single family homes, so that literally it prevented, or it would make people of colour feel uncomfortable going into these neighbourhoods, which were literally all white. So green amenities were actually physically, by design, protected by a racial cordon. So, you know, again, commenting on specific cases is very difficult, but we have the principles to be able to understand, I think, that, you know, inequality is not just simply inequality in financial terms. Inequality is also about inequality of access to these green spaces. And, you know, I do raise Canadian cities slightly above US cities, which were explicitly racially segregated, as I mentioned. So, but again, on specific cases, I'm happy to speak to people and look into that. But it's difficult to actually comment on a specific locality. But we have.
I wish we were worthy of your praise. We've got lots of examples in Canada as well, in histories of cities being racially divided, and very purposefully so. So the systemic racism absolutely exists here as well.
Oh yeah, yeah. But it's really interesting, actually, Hilary. When I spent time in Canada, I mean, you know, a lot of Canadians would say, you know, racism doesn't exist, blah, 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 blah. And then the final thing that people would say is, well, at least it's not as bad as in the United States. That was almost like the liberal last line of defense. Well, at least it's not as bad as in the United States. But yeah, you know, it exists in many forms.
Yeah. We're working you hard here, Julian. Are you okay to take a few more questions?
Sure, absolutely.
Oh, wonderful. There've been lots coming into the question box. One is from Justin, and Justin asks that your presentation is focused mostly on cities, but do you also see the same inequalities playing out in rural communities and in communities that have food deserts?
Yeah. So, well, two questions there. Yeah, I mean, I'm in urban planning. That's why I focus on urban areas. I don't really focus that much on rural areas. But yes, we do see these issues playing out in rural areas, albeit on a smaller scale. In fact, one of the chapters in Cultivating Food Justice is by a former student of mine who went on to do a PhD looking at rural food deserts in Vermont and New Hampshire. And they occur for different reasons to food deserts in urban areas. I mean, again, well, we don't use, many of us are moving on from the term food deserts to food apartheid. Food desert doesn't really, certainly in urban areas, do justice to the fact that these are not accidents. These are not economic abnormalities caused by imperfect markets. No, food deserts in US cities are part of what I was describing with Minneapolis. They are part of racialized zoning, racialized covenants. They're part of the devaluation and financial flight from low-income neighborhoods. So there's many reasons why these physical areas called food deserts, or the concept of food apartheid, exists. But yes, these issues exist in rural areas. But again, it's not something that I study. I study cities largely because it's increasingly where the majority of the population is living.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Soraya asks about some specific strategies. You have mentioned some in your talk about how we can redesign our cities so we don't have racial and class-based inequities. Can you just highlight a few of your favorite strategies, maybe ones that you haven't had a chance to mention in your talk?
Yeah. Well, you know, going back first, I think, is to this point of recognition. You know, it's not just about recognizing groups in society, it's recognizing that we have a problem. And I did mention that there is a mayoral election coming up in Boston. One of the candidates, Michelle Wu, has a food justice agenda for Boston. And it begins, food justice is racial justice. Food justice should decenter white supremacy in local food systems. hello, that is recognition of where the problem lies. And she then goes out over the next 20, 30 pages to lay out a series of policies, not just food related, but employment related, urban planning related, which will change the nature of the food system in Boston if she were elected. So I think first we have to recognize that these many of these issues in cities are located in socioeconomic and racially bound ways. And unless we recognize that, then we won't develop strategies to ameliorate that. Now, I mean, there are cities around the world that are doing, I think, great work on social justice and sustainability. The city of Belo Horizonte in Brazil is the city, according to Francis Moore Lappe, the food writer, the city that abolished hunger. And again, what they did was, in the early 90s, the then mayor, who had grown up in food insecurity, centered food with dignity, social justice, and the Brazilian constitutional right to food in designing a food security system of which the city was the main agent. They brought in private sector, non-profits. The city still fixes the cost of certain foodstuffs at a certain price for people on benefits. Imagine that, a city intervening in the market in a capitalist nation. And, you know, this was a socialist worker mayor, and now it's not a socialist worker mayor, but that mayor has not dismantled this system because it's extremely popular. I think here's the hope. Progressive policymaking and progressive policymaking, if it's embedded well in communities and popular, it's very difficult to unpick by a mayor that doesn't share those sentiments. So I urge you, go and take a look at the city of Belo Horizonte, city of about 3 or 4 million in Brazil, but they focused and centered social justice, the right to food, and food with dignity. It's that point I made, my very final point. Unless we start with these issues, we won't get to them. We can't have social justice and equity as second order issues, desirable but not essential. They have to be baked in at the beginning of policy making. Just as in Curitiba, the bus rapid transit, it wasn't about environmental issues. Bus rapid transit in the 70s was because Jaime Lerner knew that there was unequal access to the city's resources. Medellin, Colombia, social urbanism, targeting resources at the poorest. This idea of urban acupuncture, again, targeting resources at the poorest. So we need to go in, I think, at the level of really thinking about how social justice can spread good practice. And, you know, there are many, many examples. I mean, another example, I think, of where, well, Hamilton, Ontario has got a bike share scheme that is being admired by a lot of people because they thought about issues of equity and social justice. Most bike share schemes are a business model that favors well-off neighborhoods, docking stations in well-off neighborhoods. Hamilton, the city, I believe, has intervened in this. And that's one thing I want to see more, city interventions in markets, like Belo Horizonte, like Hamilton's done. And, you know, one of my students in her reflection last week, when we were talking about some of these cities, she said, if Medellin can do it, why can't Boston do it? I mean, you think of these hugely wealthy cities, Toronto, Boston, and the intellectual resources and capital, the financial resources and capital. Why aren't we doing some of these incredible things? Is it a lack of vision? I think it is. Those mayors in those cities that I mentioned have a philosophy. They're not just jugglers between the needs of the unions, private developers, and the vocal white middle class. These cities and these mayors have visions, and I think we need more of that, visionary mayors.
Well, and actually, Pam Miller has asked a question along those same lines. Pam asks, what kinds of questions can we be asking our politicians and our urban planners to be fair, the city of Toronto certainly is beginning better at engaging members of the public in the urban design process, but what kind of questions can we bring to those tables?
Well, I mean, you know, who benefits, who loses? why are we doing this? And I mean, it's about asking the right questions. See, too often, because of this obsession with becoming, we're always thinking about solutions to our cities. What we need to be thinking about is the questions, asking the right questions of our politicians and asking the right questions. And they are frequently the social justice questions about belonging. Who gets to belong? Will this have a benefit or a disbenefit? I mean, we're all thinking now about resilience, but some recent work in Boston has shown that so East Boston is close to Logan Airport. It's largely Latinx working class community, but there's huge gentrification, new condos going in, and the private developer in cahoots with Boston City Council are building resilience platforms. They're raising these buildings up. Research has now shown that this is going to worsen the chance of flooding in the lower income communities. So it's almost like the rich in these new condos are building islands of resilience that will not just protect them, but will worsen the lack of resilience. Questions weren't asked. The right questions weren't asked. All that was asked was, hey, let's use resilience. And just as the city of Seattle cynically used sustainability infrastructure to get rid of homeless people, my worry is that we are using resilience and sustainability, which have got quite big public support, to do things that are actually going to worsen conditions for those least able to protect themselves. That's our big challenge. So it's almost like, it's really getting politicians to ask the right questions, or us asking the right questions of politicians.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I have one last question for you today, and that comes from Adam Young. Adam asks about COVID's physical distancing and the common space gathering restrictions that this has impacted on some more than others. And the question is, how do you think that urban design advances for just sustainability have been impacted by the pandemic? And what do our cities need to do post-pandemic to hopefully make up some of this lost ground?
Well, great question. And, I mean, what a horrific time in human history we've been through. But in trying to see glimmers of light, we have several in urban planning. I mean, people have seen the value of public space. People want to be out, physically distanced, doing what they do. People have seen road spaces emerging that they hadn't seen before. Less cars, more people cycling. I believe the demand on the cycle market was such that you couldn't get a bike. Bike shops were empty. People are rediscovering the outdoors. One of the questions that I have, and a lot of people have, and I'm sure you have, is how do we mainstream this new awareness amongst urban planners and this new resolve amongst elected officials to make these changes permanent? Last night I sat on Massachusetts Avenue in Central Square, Cambridge, and had a beer with some friends, and we're virtually halfway into the middle of the road. The road has been narrowed because the businesses want platforms out into the road to make up for spaces that they can't have indoors. Now, question is, should we just be doing this on a business basis? But I can see our streets beginning to change. People like spaces in streets. And I think one thing that it's really changing is people are starting to see streets not simply as conduits for vehicles, but as meeting spaces. And, when I talked about complete streets, I invoked Doreen Massey, the geographer, who sees streets as places. Let's see the street as a place, not simply as a conduit. So I think new paradigms are starting to emerge. How do we mainstream those paradigms such that we increase the public realm rather than going back to a more restricted public realm?
Wow, this has just been a wonderful talk to start us off on a day full of workshop sessions. Julian, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us this morning. I think our challenge now as educators is to take these concepts, to bring them into our teaching, and also to think about how we can enact some of these, get involved in our own communities to make urban planning and food justice, a more equitable undertaking in both regards. So thank you so much for this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much. I would like to also send a special thank you to TD Friends of the Environment Foundation, who really have helped our conference to enact one of its guiding principles, which is equity, diversity, and inclusion, by removing barriers to access for Indigenous participants. So today is the final of 4 days of our EECOM 2021 conference. And what a conference it's been so far. There are close to 50 sessions on offer today from incredible educators and presenters from across the country and beyond. While many of these sessions will be recorded for later viewing, there's nothing like joining in live to interact with other delegates and presenters. And we encourage all of you to do so as best you can. Please do check out the Eco Expo beginning at 12:30 to connect with over 30 environmental organizations across the country, as well as network with other conference delegates. That's been a lot of fun. It's almost like speed dating in a way, but it's what a great way to meet people you might not have met before. And this is accessible through our conference portal. And of course, please share your conference experiences by participating in one of our conference magic activities or posting your insights and reflections on social media. And we've all been sharing the hashtag EECOM, capital, EECOM 2021. And please do come back to join us for the closing session at 4:30 this afternoon. The EECOM Awards ceremony will take place, and we'll have an official closing with Nancy Rowe of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And as with previous days, of course, if you run into any issues during the conference, just email us at conferences@ecoschools.ca, and a member of our incredible conference team will help you as soon as they can. So thank you for supporting this conference and demonstrating that educators from across the country and beyond are dedicated to playing a critical role in addressing the climate crisis. And thanks to Julian this morning, working towards just sustainabilities. Have a wonderful day of teaching, learning, and connecting together.